If you've only seen the first and second Guardians of the Galaxy films, then watching this third film may make you feel as I do some mornings, when I'm still half asleep and think I can smell my wife burning toast in the kitchen, only to realize it's the remains of last night's bonfire where I cooked my latest variation of crab, oyster and mackerel for the 900th time since I found myself shipwrecked on this godforsaken island. You see, much has changed in the intervening years between films 2 and 3, and audiences who haven't kept up to speed with everything that's happened in the Marvel Cinematic Universe are forced to play catch-up, as the filmmakers try their best to maintain the continuity set by all the other bloody Marvel films these characters have appeared in, while trying to keep Guardians-only fans on board. The result is a slightly jarring and uneven final film that feels more like Guardians 4 than 3. As I said, our gang of intergalactic misfits are all at considerably different points in their lives since the events of the second film, which was released back in 2017. A long time when you consider it's almost 10 years since the release of the original in 2014, and that the sequel came out only 3 years after. But perhaps this gap works to the film's advantage, as it's been so long since we saw the Guardians in their own standalone film, that it's hard to remember exactly where we left these characters at the end of film 2 anyway. Just as I can barely remember the smile on my wife's face when I told her I was going to sail to the Americas in a one-man dinghy. Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord, who was without doubt the central protagonist in the first 2 films, has less of a focus this time around, and while he's still very much the leader, proactively pushing the plot forward from point A to point B, the Guardian who steals the spotlight this time around is Rocket. However, it's not the sarcastic and sardonic Rocket we're used to, and in fact that version of him is barely in the film, being taken out of proceedings early on. No, it's Rocket when he was a raccoon pup, as told in a series of flashbacks, when he was first made into the intelligent hybrid we're familiar with by his creator and the film's villain, the High Evolutionary, a cross between Sid from Toy Story and Drax from James Bond's Moonraker. No, not that Drax. This Drax. This High Evolutionary gives Rocket his human-like intelligence because he's obsessed with creating a race of animal hybrid people to populate a new and improved Earth. I once tried a similar idea myself, but I abandoned it when my new and improved race of coconut people turned against me, and I was forced to genocide them and reuse their bodies to help me build this very shack. These flashback scenes of Rocket's origin are the strongest parts of the film, as we watch this tiny raccoon pup stand on 2 feet and begin to make sense of his surroundings via his new human-like perspective for the first time, while innocently making friends and playing with his fellow captive animal hybrids, all too young and naive to know the real reason why they have been made like this in the first place, making these scenes feel like a dark Pixar film, and that's certainly not intended for children. I'd say the first 3/4 of Guardians 3 are just as enjoyable as the first 2 films, with amazing special effects, well-directed action, genuinely hilarious and surreal moments, mixed with the serious and emotionally harrowing scenes with Baby Rocket. And apart from their dark and disturbing nature, the rest of the film is a fun, adventurous, sci-fi romp through the universe that's just as enjoyable as the rush you only get when sailing full speed into a choppy sea during an enormous thunderstorm. However, around the 100-minute mark, where the story feels like it's building up to a satisfying conclusion, and we're anticipating seeing the villain's ultimate plan come to fruition, the film suddenly loses its way, with an overly long and exhausting action sequence that spans a mind-numbingly long 42 minutes, resulting in an underwhelming and drawn-out third act that doesn't deliver on the promises set up earlier in the film. Spoilers! Personally, I was looking forward to seeing the villain begin the creation of his new and improved utopia, and was hoping I'd be allowed to catch my breath from the action to enjoy a tense and drawn-out finale, sat on the edge of my log, and watching in horror and amazement as the High Evolutionary put the finishing touches in place to achieve his ultimate goal. But the villain's plans are stopped before they have a chance to get going, and every bloody character from the franchise suddenly turns up all guns blazing for a big boring laser and explosion-filled action sequence we've seen in other superhero and sci-fi films countless times before, and I found my mind was beginning to drift, like so many unseaworthy rafts I've watched sail away into the sunset. It's disappointing the story doesn't follow through with and fully explore the themes set up in Acts 1 and 2 to their conclusion, as there are so many big ideas introduced earlier that a skilled writer could keep most of the film exactly as it is, and come up with a completely different ending that could have elevated this to being the best and most profound Guardians film in the series. I wanted to see the High Evolutionary on the verge of succeeding in his plans, perhaps having imprisoned the Guardians on his ship and landing on some unpopulated and untouched paradise, and letting his new race of perfect beings set foot on a new world, as the Guardians await their fate of being forcibly upgraded into genetically modified mutants themselves, and seeing the High Evolutionary walking amongst them as the god he truly believes himself to be. Seeing his fantasies being fulfilled, and having finally reached his ideal, would have added a greater depth and dimension to the character than what we ultimately saw, and would have made him the perfect embodiment of the man who lives by the mantra, the ends justify the means. Then we could have had a genuine dilemma within the Guardians about what they should do. Should they bring an end to his new utopia, now his mission is complete and he's no longer a threat, or just leave him be, even though he's destroyed so many lives to reach this point? But sadly, the villain seems to disappear during most of the film's overly long finale, as if the film didn't know what to do with him, just as it doesn't seem to know what to do with the other newly introduced characters, who keep popping up and disappearing again throughout the film. Also, this may just be the result of too many hours sat in the midday sun, but I thought the conclusion was very reminiscent of the ending of the anime film Mary and the Witch's Flower, where animals being kept in captivity to be experimented on are released from their cages. It makes for a great visual, but I wonder whether the filmmakers weren't exactly sure how they should end the film. And as the plot of Witch's Flower shares many similarities to the plans of the High Evolutionary, perhaps they thought a live-action version of this animated scene would be good enough, and no one would notice. Well, I noticed. I may be cut off from civilization with nothing but the shirt on my back, but I've still got my memories, you know. And after the action finally subsides, the film suddenly remembers that this is meant to be the final film in the series, and all the characters very abruptly announce their decision to split up and go their own separate ways, with very little build-up introduced earlier. It's unfortunate writer and director James Gunn decided to give us this long and drawn-out generic action sequence to end what is arguably the most original and interesting of the Marvel series, instead of a proper character-driven conclusion, where we could have said goodbye to each of the Guardians properly, and given them the send-off they truly deserved. So, all in all, a fairly entertaining Guardians film for the first 1 hour and 40 minutes, with a subpar final act that begins to wear out its welcome and shatters the promising course it was steadfastly progressing towards, leaving us with an ending that fails to answer the big questions posed earlier, and dashing our initial optimistic expectations, concluding the series in a fairly bland and unsatisfying way, when it could have been so much more.